Imagine waking one morning to find a bundle of freshly cut willow branches tied to your front door. In the lawless hills of 19th century Kentucky, this wasn't a gift. It was an ultimatum, a final warning from a secret army that judged you in the dead of night. They called themselves the White Caps, angels of justice who promised to bring order to a land drowning in chaos. But the whispers that still echo through these hollows tell a different story. A story of how saviors became monsters and how the quest for justice turned into a thirst for blood and power. How did a committee of concerned farmers become a hooded terror that ruled by the whip and the rope? Today, we separate the legend from the brutal truth and uncover the story of the Whitehead clan. To understand the White Caps, you first have to understand their world. Picture the mountains of eastern Kentucky in the years after the Civil War. This wasn't just a place, it was a world apart, a labyrinth of fog-shrouded hollows and impassable ridges that kept the modern world at bay. Life here was governed not by clocks or calendars, but by the rising of the sun and the turning of the seasons. Families lived on isolated farmsteads, miles from their nearest neighbor, carving out a life from the stubborn, rocky soil. The creek was their water, the forest their larder, and the Bible their law. The people who called these mountains home were a proud and fiercely independent stock. They were veterans of a bitter war, farmers and blacksmiths who asked for little and expected even less from outsiders. Their lives were hard, a constant struggle against the elements and the land itself, but there was an honesty to it. A man's worth was measured by the strength of his hands and the truth of his word. They wanted nothing more than to raise their children, work their land, and be left in peace under the watchful eye of God. But a shadow was falling over this simple life. In the dark corners of this isolated world, a rot had begun to set in. With no effective law to speak of, the worst of human nature was allowed to fester. There were the drunks who would trade their family's last bit of flour for a jug of corn liquor. There were the petty thieves who would steal a neighbor's livestock in the dead of night, knowing there would be no consequences. And there were the family tyrants, men who ruled their homes with a fist, whose wives and children suffered in terrified silence. For these people, justice was a distant rumor, a story told about faraway cities. The local sheriff was often a man who either lacked the courage to enforce the law or was corrupt enough to ignore it for a price. To take a grievance to the county court was an expensive days-long journey that most couldn't afford, and even then, a mountain man's word meant little to a flatland judge. Honest, hard-working families felt powerless, watching as the fabric of their community was torn apart by men who feared neither God nor government. A quiet desperation began to settle over the valleys. It was a feeling shared in hushed conversations around the pot-bellied stove at the general store and in prayers whispered in small clapboard churches. People felt abandoned, left to fend for themselves against the growing chaos. And in that fertile ground of fear and frustration, a dangerous seed was planted. It was the old mountain idea that when the law fails, men must make their own. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't just seeking justice. They were about to unleash a terror far worse than anything they had ever known. The change didn't happen overnight. It didn't start with a gunshot or a hanging, but with a whisper. A whisper that traveled from farm to farm, a shared frustration that finally found a voice in a secret meeting in an old barn. They were respected men, farmers, veterans, even a preacher or two, men who had simply had enough. They decided that if the law wouldn't protect their families, they would become the law. They took a name for themselves, the White Caps, and for their uniform, they chose the simplest, most terrifying disguise imaginable, a plain white sack with holes cut for eyes. Their first target was a man known throughout the valley for his drunken cruelty, a man who beat his wife and starved his children while he spent his days in a stupor. One morning, he awoke to find that silent message on his door. a bundle of willow switches. It was a clear ultimatum, understood by everyone in the mountains. Straighten up or face the consequences. The man, arrogant in his belief that no one would dare challenge him, laughed it off. He threw the branches into his fire and went back to his bottle. It was the last mistake he would ever make in that county. A few nights later, the community learned what happened when a warning was ignored. A procession of silent riders, their faces hidden beneath those stark white hoods, descended on the man's cabin. There were no shouts, no threats. They moved with a chilling purpose, pulling the terrified man from his bed. They dragged him out into the cold night air, his wife's pleas echoing unanswered in the darkness. They tied him to a tree and one by one took up the same kind of willow switches he had burned and delivered their brutal judgment. It wasn't just a beating, it was a ritual of public shaming, a message delivered not only to him, but to everyone. When it was over, they gave him a new ultimatum: be gone by sunrise, or they would return. The next morning, the man, broken and bleeding, gathered his few belongings and left the county forever. And a strange quiet fell over the valley. The theft stopped. The town drunkards stayed home. For the first time in years, there was a sense of order. The Whitecaps had proven that their methods worked. They had tasted power, the absolute power to inspire fear and enforce their will. And in that moment of victory, without realizing it, they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The first drops of blood had been spilled not to kill, but to correct. Yet they had watered a seed that would soon grow into a monstrous tree. The taste of power is a poison, and it didn't take long for it to blacken the souls of the Whitecaps. The original mission of punishing drunks and thieves was forgotten, replaced by a much more profitable enterprise: fear for hire. Now, a man could pay the clan to settle a land dispute in his favor. A jealous husband could arrange a visit for a rival. The white hood was no longer a symbol of justice. It had become a mask for greed, revenge, and pure, unadulterated terror. The willow switch was no longer enough. The lessons they taught now were final. Their new reign was cemented not by punishing the guilty, but by making an example of the innocent. Consider the story of a farmer, a man respected for his honesty and hard work. His only crime was courage. He had stood up in a public place and called the Whitecaps what they had become: a gang of cowardly bandits who hid their faces. He refused to join them, refused to be silent. He knew the risk, but his mountain pride would not let him bow to them. The Whitecaps heard his words, and a death sentence was passed in the shadows. One moonless night, the family's dogs, usually fierce protectors, let out a single terrified yelp before falling silent. A moment later, the cabin door didn't just open, it exploded inward, splintering off its leather hinges. Silent figures, more like ghosts than men in their white hoods, filled the small room. They said nothing. They simply pointed a finger at the father of the house, who had just sat up in his bed. The children, frozen in terror in their small cots, could only see flickering shadows and hear the sounds of a nightmare that would be seared into their memory forever. His wife threw herself at the intruders, begging, pleading, but she was thrown aside like a rag doll. They dragged the man from his home, his bare feet scraping on the cold, hard-packed dirt of the yard. His family was forced to remain inside the cabin, captives in their own home, made to watch through the shattered doorway. They saw the torchlight glinting on a rope as it was thrown over the thick branch of an old oak tree. They were being made to bear witness. This wasn't just a murder, it was a lesson, and his family were the first pupils. The children covered their ears, but it did no good. The night was filled with the sounds of a brief, desperate struggle, a man's choked gasps for air, and then a sickening, heavy snap that echoed through the hollow. After that, nothing. Just the creak of the rope and the chirping of the crickets, who seemed entirely indifferent to the horror that had just unfolded. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing, absolute silence that was somehow even worse. The hooded figures didn't linger. They melted back into the woods as silently as they had come, leaving the torch sputtering in the dirt. They left behind a grieving family and a dark shape twisting gently in the night breeze. When the first grey light of dawn touched the mountain, the neighbors would find the scene. They would see the unspeakable trophy hanging from that oak tree, and they would understand the Whitecap's new gospel. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, because in these mountains, speaking the truth was a sin punishable by death. When the sun finally rose, its light did little to chase away the darkness. It only served to illuminate the horror. The first neighbor to pass by stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't run for the sheriff. He didn't cry out in alarm. He simply turned his wagon around and went to fetch other men, speaking in low, grim whispers. There was no question of who had done this. The sight of the body, a terrible monument to the price of defiance, was a signature left by the Whitecaps. Quietly, with grim reverence, the men cut him down and carried him back to his grieving family, their faces hard masks of fear and fury they dared not express. For the widow and her children, the world had ended. Their home was no longer a sanctuary, but a tomb haunted by the final moments of a man they loved. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside was a fresh wave of terror. They couldn't stay. There was no justice to be found here, only the constant, suffocating presence of the murderers, who could be any of the men they saw every day. Their fight was not for justice, but for survival. Within a week, they packed what little they could carry, abandoned the farm their family had worked for generations, and disappeared, becoming refugees from their own home. Their departure sent a clear message to the entire county. The Whitecaps had won. A thick, suffocating blanket of silence fell over the hills and hollows. No one spoke of the murder above a whisper, and never to an outsider. The code of silence was now absolute. A new, more insidious fear took root, a paranoia that turned neighbor against neighbor. Who was hiding beneath those hoods? The man who sold you flour at the general store? The blacksmith who shod your horse? Even the preacher who spoke of God's law on Sunday? You could trust no one. An invisible empire was being built, and its mortar was the blood of good men. The local sheriff eventually rode out to the abandoned farmstead. He looked at the rope burns on the oak branch, asked a few half-hearted questions to neighbors who suddenly couldn't remember a thing, and wrote a report he knew would lead nowhere. Perhaps he was a coward, too afraid of the hooded men to conduct a real investigation. Or perhaps, and this was the most chilling thought of all, he was one of them. His badge just another mask he wore during the day. His visit was a formality, a hollow gesture that only proved one thing: the law of men had no power here anymore. The hunt for the culprits never began. How could it? You can't arrest a ghost, and the Whitecaps had become something more than men in the terrified minds of the people. They were specters of vengeance, ghost riders who emerged from the night fog to enforce their own brutal commandments. The story of the murdered farmer became a cautionary tale whispered to children, a local legend born from a truth too terrible to confront directly. The ashes of his life had fertilized the soil of their fear, and from it, the Whitecaps' reign of terror would grow unopposed, casting a long, dark shadow over the mountains. Terror cannot last forever. Eventually, a monster will devour itself. The Whitecaps grew too bold, too greedy, and their violence became indiscriminate. When they murdered the family of a state legislator over a petty land dispute, they finally crossed a line that even the cowed local authorities couldn't ignore. The outside world came flooding into the mountains, not with sheriffs this time, but with stone-faced U.S. Marshals and companies of the National Guard, men who didn't know the local families and who weren't scared of shadows in the night. Arrests were finally made, and the stage was set for a trial that would pit the law of the state against the law of the clan. The county courthouse became the center of a storm. The small town swelled with newspaper reporters from as far away as Cincinnati, with curious onlookers who wanted a glimpse of the monsters, and with the grim-faced families of both the victims and the accused. Armed guards stood on the courthouse roof, their rifles glinting in the sun, a clear sign that this was not ordinary justice. It was a war being fought in a courtroom. Inside, the air was thick with tension and sweat. Every man on the jury knew his decision would follow him home. They knew that no matter what the verdict, they would have to live with the consequences in a land where memories are long and grudges are passed down like heirlooms. The prosecution's case seemed impossible. How could you convict men when every witness was paralyzed by fear? The answer came in the form of a captured white cap, a young man facing the gallows who was offered a deal, his life for his testimony. The dam of silence finally broke. He was brought into the courtroom in chains, and with a trembling hand, he pointed out his former brothers. He named the leaders, described the secret oaths, and recounted the grim details of their night rides. You can just imagine the scene. A man confessing his sins, his voice cracking, while across the room, the men he condemned stared at him with a look of pure, cold hatred that promised a retribution beyond any courtroom's power. The defendants themselves were a portrait of mountain defiance. They weren't cowering criminals. Many of them, particularly the leaders, sat with a quiet, arrogant dignity. They stared back at the jury, not with remorse, but with contempt, as if they were the true judges in the room. In their eyes, they weren't murderers. They were soldiers who had brought order to a lawless land. And this trial was nothing more than a betrayal by the Flatlanders who didn't understand their ways. Their leader, a man known for his cunning and ruthlessness, barely paid attention, projecting an unnerving calm, confident that the web of fear he had spun for years would hold firm. Finally, the jury delivered its verdict. The room held its breath. For the men who were merely followers, the enforcers who carried out the orders, the verdict was guilty. Sentences of life in prison and the hangman's noose were handed down. A quiet wave of relief and victory washed over the prosecution and the families of the victims. But then the jury foreman came to the last name, the mastermind, the man who had orchestrated the entire reign of terror. After a long pause, the words echoed in the stunned silence. Not guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. The architect of it all, protected by intimidated witnesses and a terrified jury, stood up, gave a slight nod to his lawyer, and walked out of the courtroom, a free man, disappearing into the same mountains he had terrorized. Was this justice? A few branches of the poisoned tree had been lopped off, but the root was left untouched, allowed to burrow back into the dark soil. The trial had proven that the law of men could reach into the mountains, but it also showed its limits. It could punish the soldiers, but it couldn't touch the king. For the people who had to go back to their isolated farms, the fear didn't end that day. It just took on a new, more patient form. The Whitecaps were broken as an organization, but their shadow remained, a permanent reminder of a time when justice wore a white hood and innocence was no protection at all. The trials that broke the Whitecaps are now just faded ink in dusty courthouse ledgers. The men who were sent to the gallows have long since turned to dust, their names a footnote in a violent chapter of Kentucky's history. But what of the leader, the man who walked free? He returned to his mountain home and lived out the rest of his days. Officially, he died a peaceful old man in his own bed. But the old-timers in these mountains tell a different story. They say that while the law of men couldn't touch him, the justice of the mountains is patient. They whisper that his final years were haunted by the faces of those he condemned, and that his name, once spoken with fear, is now spoken with a quiet, knowing curse. The scars left by the Whitecaps run deeper than a single generation. To this day, there are family names in those hollows that carry the weight of that time. Descendants of the Whitecaps live alongside the descendants of their victims. The story is a ghost that sits at their dinner tables. For some, it's a source of quiet shame, a dark secret to be kept buried. For others, it's a painful heirloom, a reminder of a resilience forged in terror and loss. The blood feuds may be over, but the memory lingers in the bloodline, a quiet rift that separates neighbor from neighbor even now. You can still find the physical traces of that time if you know where to look. The old county courthouse still stands, its brick walls a silent witness to the drama that unfolded within. On a quiet afternoon, you can almost hear the echoes of the prosecutor's accusations and feel the weight of the jury's fear. Not far from there, in a small, overgrown cemetery, you can find the tombstones of the men the Whitecaps murdered. The weathered inscriptions are simple and direct, telling you the day they were born and the day they died, but they leave out the most important part of the story: how they died and why. The oak tree where the farmer was hanged may or may not still stand, but its legend does, a dark landmark in the collective memory of the community. Most people have forgotten this story. The world has moved on, and the violent nights of the Whitecaps seem like a tale from another world. But the mountains remember. They hold these stories in the deep shadows of their hollows and in the rustle of the leaves on a moonless night. The official histories may have been written, but the true story, the human story of terror, courage, and survival, is preserved in the oral tradition passed down from one generation to the next. It has become a part of the landscape itself, a ghost that walks these hills, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting in the silence to be heard. So we come back to the question we started with, the one that hangs over this entire story like a mountain fog. How did a group of men who only wanted to protect their families become the very monsters they sought to destroy? The answer is as simple as it is terrifying. The Whitecaps weren't born evil. They were created by a vacuum, a space where law and order had died, and something had to take its place. They set out to be the cure, but without any checks on their power, the cure became a poison far deadlier than the disease. They learned that the power to punish is the power to control, and the power to control is the most addictive drug on earth. This isn't just a story about a band of hooded night riders from a bygone era. It's a timeless warning about the darkness that lies dormant in the human heart, waiting for the right circumstances to be unleashed. It's a testament to the fact that the road to hell is truly paved with good intentions. The Whitecaps are a brutal lesson in how easily the thirst for justice can curdle into a lust for blood, and how the hero who slays the dragon can, in time, grow scales of his own. It's a story of the indomitable Appalachian spirit, yes, but it reveals the dark side of that spirit, a fierce, unforgiving independence that, when twisted, respects no law but its own. The men who wore those white hoods are long gone. The ropes have rotted, and the willow trees they used for their warnings have grown old and died. But the story remains. It's been passed down, whispered from father to son, a chilling bedtime story that just happens to be true. It serves as a permanent reminder, etched into the very soul of these mountains, that the most dangerous men are often those who believe they are doing God's work. They teach us that fear is the cruelest of masters, and that true justice can never, ever be found hiding behind a mask.